We are we're heading towards the last educational session of this series with Steve, and he's going to share a PowerPoint with us and explain and the need for Republican Labour.
Yes. Okay. Thank you, Carol. And that front cover, that quote is a really good quote. I mean, it sort of pops up every week, and if you haven't looked at it somewhere, do have a look at it, because it often gets to the essence of or part of the essence of what I've been talking about. And this is this apparent contradiction between the crown becoming the queen and the queen having no power, and on the other hand, it appears that the crown has now got this huge amount of power, and that's what we've been sort of looking at the whole time through this. So obviously what I'm going to try to do, and I think it's too big a task as I looked at it, to try to draw together a whole series, this whole series of talks about Republican socialism. And you will be pleased to know, I'm going to ruin my joke now, I think, but my joke was going to be, I've stapled all my pages together, okay, so as to avoid the Budger Johnson problem. And not only that, I've numbered the pages, you know what I mean? So I know it, and then I've been practicing my counting, you know, so I know that page 4 comes after page 5. But obviously with the little bit of problem we had with the Zoom call, I think I've gone and blown that joke. Anyway, I think the joke's on me, but never mind. Anyway, so my first one is just to say, summary and conclusions. This is summary and conclusions number 11. And if you just recall ourselves, that is actually the list of the 10 that we've done already. We started with Republican Labour. Most of them are about to be on the LLA website. We talked about the state, the crown, the union, social monarchy, what is bureaucratic socialism, the degenerate social monarchy, Republican socialism, and I ended up last time talking about Tory England. Now, I would like to think, I hope that these talks will be a resource, if you like, that we might, so it's not a pamphlet exactly, but I'm hoping that if we want to talk to other people, we might be able to use some or all of these, you know, as an educative tool in some way, or a discussion or a way of discussing. So I hope we can promote and use some of them, and that they will be useful for building support for what we're going to do as a way of explaining Republican socialist ideas. Now, I'm not going to try and do a quick run through. I did originally, but I'll do a quick run through of points from all of those 10. And I realize that's completely ridiculous, so I shan't even try to do that. So I thought instead that I would, first of all, I'm going to begin with Tony Benn. But before I do that, I'm going to do a little bit of dialectics with you, first of all, because I think that also helps thinking about the problem. So let me just see what my next one is. Okay, so dialectics. So I'm going to just talk a little bit about, first of all, this idea of the struggle of opposites. So that's going to inform what I'm going to be saying. And one way of thinking of it is to think of this as thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. So you could think that, and I think this is true, that if the thesis was republicanism and the antithesis was socialism, then the synthesis would be Republican socialism, drawing both of the things together. Now, that is historically what happened, because in the 19th century, the working class movement was basically Republican in it, radical Republican by and large in its politics. I mean, certainly the left wing, if you like, of it was. And that's because they were informed very much, not only by the English Commonwealth, but especially the French Revolution, and even the American Revolution as well. So if you went on demos, you would see the Stars and Stripes, or you would see the French tricolour or the flag of the cap of liberty on the demonstrations. Because don't forget, it wasn't really socialism in a way we would see it. And Karl Marx didn't write Das Kapital until the 1860s. I forget the exact date on the top of my head. And obviously after Marx had written Capital, that change began to impact on the working class movement in all sorts of ways. So in this first stage in the 19th century, we had a sort of non-socialist republicanism. And then in this country, when socialism took over, as it were, in the after mid 1870s into the 1880s, 1890s, and so on, we started to get a kind of non-republican socialism. It's kind of socialism without any republicanism in it, because socialism had kind of liquidated republicanism, and so that disappeared. And so we're living at the tail end of an epoch where republicanism doesn't figure in the socialist ideas. Certainly I'm talking about here, by the way. I'm not talking about the world or anything like that. I'm not talking about here. So in a way, if the dialectic works, then that republicanism and that socialism should come together as a kind of synthesis. And I think that's the stage we're at. There's a historical process where we're now going to find that our socialism is inadequate without going back to our republican roots and traditions. And this is not just simply adding together, and I've emphasized this point, republicanism plus socialism, and that's it. Because when people add it together, they just think, well, that's anti-monarchism. Well, let's have the same old socialism and just call it, we don't want the Queen. And I've been at pains to stress the idea that that is not what republicanism is all about. It's something quite different or distinct from that. So that's the first bit of dialectical thinking, that we're in an epoch where republican socialism is our future. Logically, it's going to come into things. So that's what we're talking about, is something that ought to be coming into play now as we go 19th century, 20th century. Here we are in the 21st century. So I do think that's a process. Let's have a look a minute. So, and I call that a new epoch. A new epoch. An English socialist movement doesn't, and the problem we got is the English socialist movement doesn't understand republican socialism, by the way. I think that's where we are at. And the more we argue with people, the more we realize that's true. And it is confused with anti-monarchical socialism. You know, don't forget, so the anti-monarchical, don't forget to abolish the Queen socialism. When we achieve socialism, we'll abolish all these irrelevant feudal leftovers. Again, that's all missing the point, but you will get those kind of arguments as to why republicanism is really something that belongs in the 17th and 18th centuries, or even the 19th century. So I think republican socialism is the future, and I think there's a process going on of that. Now I'm going to try another bit of dialectics on you, which will be the double negative. So I'll try up a double negative. Okay, so let's go for a double negative. So this is the idea, the double negation. It's the idea that X, whatever X is, turns into its opposite, which is Y. Okay, I've just symbolized it as Y. And then this Y then double negates, it turns itself back to X again. But you'll notice that this X is not the same as the original X. That's why I've given it two crosses there to indicate it's a slightly different color, to indicate, although it's an X, it's a slightly different X. Okay, so that's called a double negation. Something turns into its opposite, then it turns back into its original, but it's a different thing. And if we try to give an example of that, I think that one, yeah. So a republic, and this was always the case in the story of Rome, turns into an empire. In the story of ancient Rome, the whole thing about the Roman Republic was that it represented a sort of freedom, and then it turned into the Roman Empire. With Julius, certain processes went on, and so Rome lost any of its kind of freedoms, and it became an empire. It became a super imperial superpower. Now, the logic of this is that it's going to turn back into a republic again, but a different republic. Now, I don't know if I can follow that one through, this second negation, but I'm going to give it. So, in a way, the empire creates kind of slavery all over the world. The terrible oppression and slavery that the empire imposed, and then it leads to people revolting against the Roman Empire. And now I haven't really studied that process enough, but I just thought I'd give you, that's a kind of example, I mean, of a sort of double negative. So I'm going to try my own version of this. Okay, it's my own version of this story as this sort of arc of history. So I'm going to do it like this. So I'm going to go, what we got here, here's the arc of history. So we're going to start with the English Commonwealth of 1649. And I can actually tell this story right the way through as a history story, but we won't unfortunately have time to do that now. But there's a process by which the English Commonwealth turns into the British Empire with slaves and colonies. So there's a negation of the freedom that the people thought they were getting at the time of the Commonwealth, at the height of the revolution of 1649. And then somewhere, go down 50 years, we've got the British Empire with slaves and colonies. Okay, so it's like an opposite. And then I would argue that, well, if we follow that through, what that means is that that empire should turn back into the English Commonwealth again. Maybe, I don't know what date I've got there, they're going to 2021, but whatever date it's going to be, if it's 2021 or 2022 or whenever it will be, or 2050, I don't know exactly. But you notice a slightly different color, so it's not going to be like the one of 1649. It sort of is, but it isn't. I mean, obviously, we're a completely different world in the 21st century than we're in the 17th century. And there's a working class now which didn't exist then at that time, and so on and so forth. So before we go all there, it is a different world. But there's a way in which we can think of ourselves as in a historical process, we are moving towards the English Commonwealth, according to this. Now, the point of saying that is not that you can predict it or know when it'll happen, because it actually requires, it's not going to happen automatically. It can only struggle can get you there. But it can give you the confidence that that's the direction we are heading towards. And it can help our thinking of how we can get to that process. It can give us confidence. That's where we are going. So we're on so it's like saying we're on a journey. It may take weeks, it may take years, it could take decades. We don't really know that. It's not automatic. It depends on the struggle. But the double negative idea gives us a strength and confidence that we're on the right track here by doing that. It doesn't mean, therefore, that we should be passive, but rather it allows us to be a stronger voice, a more conscious representation of the future in the present. Okay, the future that's arriving in the present, because the English Commonwealth, if it comes, is not going to come out, it's going to come out of something in our society. Now I'm going to modify that process, just modify that diagram slightly. Is that okay, comrades, by the way? We're okay with that at the moment. I'm going to modify that diagram slightly in this way, sort of fill it in a little bit, make it slightly more complicated. This time I've just taken the idea of the Union and the Empire. So really, if you go from, if the Commonwealth would be over on the left, with the Commonwealth, the two Commonwealths have gone out the diagram for the moment. Imagine they're still there in the previous diagram. But the English Commonwealth becomes the rise of the British Union. It turns itself in, and we could go through battles. I could tell you the history story of what happens in 1649 when the Levellers are defeated at Burford, and Cromwell sends the army to Ireland, and there's a Drogheda and there's Wexford, and then later, a year later, he goes to Scotland to fight the Battle of Dunbar, and he wins the Battle of Dunbar. Then he beats Charles II. By the way, Charles II is crowned king in Edinburgh and Dublin in 1649. As soon as Charles I is executed, the Irish and the Scots crown Charles II, his son, as king. And so Cromwell goes off to fight. Now, I'm not going to go. So what I'm saying, there's a proper historical story here, and you could go through that. So this rise of the British Union from the defeat of 1649, from the defeat of the Levellers, from the Democrats which was the Leveller Party, and the Diggers, which represented the socialists, if you like, who wanted to be able to dig for food on common land and all that sorts of things. Those defeats of those progressive forces ends up in the British Empire, it ends up in slavery, it ends up in the slave. So when we get to the 18th century, that's when Britain is created, and it's created in a whole series of wars between Britain and France. And again, I've got time to go through those wars, but that's how the British Empire is actually forged. And then that goes on, and then you've got the American Revolution, you've got the French Revolution. So we could go right the way through the British Empire, and then we're at this other end of this story over here on the right, where we've got the fall of the British what is it? The fall of the British Union. Right, we're in that period now, starting in 1921, when Ireland, the whole part of Ireland, broke away. So we ended up with Northern Ireland, Scotland, and Wales, and we're still going through this whole process where the British Union is now under threat from democratic movements in Wales and Scotland, and still in Ireland. So that's, to me, is the kind of the process that's kind of going on. And I had a quote at the bottom of this from John Denham, who's the director of the English Labour Network. I referred to him before, and he said, and I agree with this, he says, there would be no empire without the union, and no union without the empire. So in other words, the union of England, Scotland, Wales was the launch pad of the British Empire, and the decline of the British Empire, which is in our epoch, is the unraveling of the union. And hence it's moving us towards the English Commonwealth, I'd say. But, you know, as I keep saying, this is not automatically it's going to go there. We could have fascism instead. So I don't want to make it like an automatic process, but potential is there. So I thought I would, at that point, go back to Tony Benn then. So that's just my kind of introductory points about the working out of processes. So I want to go now back to Tony Benn. I thought the next thing I'll do, I'll go back to Ben. And what I wanted to say about Ben, well, Marie said some good things the other night when we were on the Left Labour Alliance thing as well. And it is worth looking a bit more into it. And remember that Tony Benn was the Postmaster General. Is it Postmaster General? Yeah, I think Postmaster General in the Wilson government, 64 to 66. And one of the things that he did, funnily enough, was he tried to get the Queen's head removed from the stamps. You know, the stamps on the Queen's head. And he was vetoed over that one. The Queen did not like that at all. So that never really happened. So that was the beginning. It all went wrong from that point onwards, I think. But then, of course, as Marie said, and comrades know, because we all know Tony, all of us, I'm sure, know Tony Benn anyway, so I'm not telling everybody we don't know, but obviously Ben has got a great record of struggle, as we all know that, because we've all been, you know, through that area. We just think, I'm just looking at some of the things. He supported Upper Clyde shipbuilders. He opposed the Falklands War in 1983, I think it was. He supported the women's camp at Greenham Common. He opposed the poll tax. He fully supported the NUM, the miners' strike, 1984. He was a big ally of Arthur Scargill. He opposed the Afghan wars and the Iraq wars, and many, many more things that Tony Benn did. But I think that this bill that most people don't know about, this 1992 bill, to me is very significant. That's why I've wanted to sort of have some focus on it. And so I thought I'd list some reasons why I think it's significant, this bill. The first one, oh, I got one missing from my list. Okay, I got one I've got one before that. The first one that I should have, oh no, I've got it there, it's number 2. Not in order. Okay. The first one is he took it to the House of Commons. That in itself is a significant thing to do. He actually got a bill together and went through the process of taking it to the House of Commons. That's pretty serious. So it was a serious endeavour. He had never had any chance of winning it. He's not a stupid man. He knew that he was going to lose. But nevertheless, he went through the process of asking permission for the Queen to be able to put his bill to Parliament. So that's the first reason why a socialist of his stature, doing something like that, that's serious. Our second point, and I think Marie made this point the other day, was that he had this experience of being a minister of the crown. Now that's significant because he understood how the civil service worked from the inside, from being an insider in this as a minister of the crown. And he saw that the civil service, which is really the servants of the crown, if you like, were a major factor in maintaining the policies of the Tory state, as I call it, the Tory state. And if you remember the Yes Minister comedy shows, the comedy series, which was one of my favorite series in the 1980s, I think it was, when we recognized that the civil servants, the top civil servants, the mandarins, as they were called with reference to China, they had an immense power in deciding what went on. So this huge bureaucracy of the crown and the role of these mandarins was very, very significant. The crown, therefore, wasn't a feudal leftover, but a powerful institution. Now, I'm not going to repeat the quote at the beginning, you know, where he says, where Ben tells us that the power, we've been told that the power goes from the lords to from the monarchy to the lords, from the throne to the lords, from the lords to commons, from the commons to the people. It sounds like we're getting more democratic all the time, whereas Tony Benn says in reality it's the opposite of that. All the power of the crown is concentrated in the hands of a very few people at the top, an oligarchy, not least the prime minister, in all of that. And he has that quote in his book. So that's the next one. That Ben had a sense of history, saw the importance of history. That's where the word Commonwealth comes from, which meant republic, which meant a social kind. I thought it meant a social kind of republic. I mean, George might maybe not totally agree with that, but I think in its proper meaning, the Commonwealth means a republic, but one that has the welfare of people at his heart, which he has in his bill. And Ben was a regular attender at the Burford commemorations, rallies that take place every year in May. And if you haven't been, we ought to go. You know, I've been a few times to those rallies, those celebrations, organised by the Oxford Trades Council. And Ben was a regular attender there, because Burford was the place where the Leveller mutineers were defeated, and the counter-revolution against Ireland and all the things that when Cromwell's counter-revolution kicked in, and that was the end of the Republic really being a democratic body at all, with the defeat of those Leveller soldiers. So Ben, that's why it's called the Commonwealth Bill. You know, he's used that term. And then he's breaking with the social monarchist tradition of the left. You know, that the basic idea, the basic idea is that we're working through this Tory state to get reforms without really changing any of the fundamental power structures. I said he's serious about the issue. Then he had the book that he wrote to explain it that we've used here. Some comrades have got it. And then, of course, he had the support of 8 Labour MPs, including ones that you might know, Tony Banks, Ken Livingstone, and last but not least, of course, Jeremy Corbyn. So Jeremy Corbyn was almost like his second in command. And so we have to say, really, and that's what I say was peculiar about the 2019 election, is that Jeremy Corbyn was the first Republican leader of the Labour Party since George Lansbury MP in the 1930s. That's a surprising thing because Corbyn never played his Republican card or did any promotion of it, but that's a fact. He called himself a Republican, and then he signed up to the Privy Council because he had to do as Labour leader. That was his test of loyalty or loyalism. Nevertheless, it's odd that we should have a Republican leader, and then we had somebody who I think was like Enoch Powell in Boris Johnson. You know, it was like Enoch Powell and Tony Benn fighting it out in the 2019 general election. It's that politics have become so strange. Now, let's say, okay. I'm just going to remind ourselves that Ben's 1992 bill had parliaments for England, Scotland and Wales. It had the idea of a federal republic. It was in favour of withdrawal from Northern Ireland, giving up any control of Northern Ireland. I put question mark regional assemblies. I don't think it has it there. Proportional representation. He doesn't have that. So I don't want to say that I think this is a perfect bill, and I've never tried to see like that. There's other things as well, local authorities, but he does do things about those. The bill is therefore very worth looking at. I don't think we just have to rubber stamp it. I think we have to have a sort of critique and understanding of it. A critique and understanding of it. So I wanted, therefore, let's have a look a minute, if it goes in this direction. Yeah, I wanted to just go back over republicanism again. So I'm going to go back, because remember of those 10 talks, the first 3, starting with Republican Labour, republicanism, and the Republican states. So I'm kind of going back to those a little bit. The first thing to say, so I think I might actually, hold on a second. I think I might. Yeah. Okay, I think I've got these in the slightly wrong order. So I think I might go there and come back. So there's republicanism. I'm going to come back to that one. I'm going to start here. I'm going to go slightly backwards in the order. It doesn't matter to you. So this is the next one we're going to look at. So I'm now going to talk a little bit about republicanism. And another bit of dialectics was the method that I was employing, which was to think of Republican socialism as a unity of opposite things. So republicanism and socialism fuse together as if it's one, but we can pull them apart into republicanism and socialism. It's a bit like what Marx did with the commodity. He pulled it apart into use value and value and exchange value. You're pulling them apart in order that you can understand each one separately. And then when you've understood them separately, you can understand better how they fit together. So at the start of the talk, I went off down a Republican route. I said, well, ignoring socialism for now on, but we'll come back to it eventually and see how it fits together. So I think that if we want to understand, rather than just simply adding the Queen to our list of things as socialists, we want to get to an understanding of republicanism. We need to understand it separately. We need to pull it apart and give it its own examination. And so I was thinking that maybe we could think of it in the old terms of ownership and control. You know, we think about companies being, we talk about companies and having ownership and control. Well, socialism, you could say, was about ownership or socialization. Who owns the business? Who owns the business? But republicanism could be more about control. So in that case, let's examine control rather than ownership. Let's forget about ownership for the minute, not because ownership isn't important, but just we want to look at it itself. So the idea of Republican democracy is about how do we get control of things. And so we stress this idea that Republican democracy was democracy based on the sovereignty of the people. In other words, it comes from below, from the people organizing themselves, and then making sure that people are elected, accountable, and subject to recall, and they're paid no more than the average wage. So that's that's what we want to emphasize, and that's a very important idea that we could be activists in the working class movement with just that. It would be still quite radical. We could ignore socialism altogether and we'd still have quite a radical program of democracy if we're applying that in the Labour Party or applying it anywhere. So therefore Republican democracy, sovereignty and control from below. And that's why you can speak about workers' control, the idea of workers' control. You can have a private company and you can have quite a degree of workers' control. What does that mean? Well, it means if you had a car factory, like Ford's car factory, where Ford's is owned by a big American corporate giant, the Ford Corporation of America, but you could still have within that factory, if you've got a strong shop stewards organization, you could have a measure of control by the workers, exercising a certain degree of control. And that's the Republican side of it. Now, of course, they can never wrest that control while it remains privately owned. So it's not that ownership's irrelevant or anything like that. I'm not arguing that. That's not my point. Is that the working class is always struggling to get more. People are always struggling. Oh, something's gone and happened here. What is that? Sorry. Where did we get to? Sorry, we just lost that. Something decides to come up and there we go. That's it. I don't know what you saw. Adobe Flash Player just decided to jump up. I think it's Boris Johnson in disguise to trying to twiddle with my presentation. I don't know if that came. I don't know if never mind. Never mind. So in following through this argument about republicanism and democracy. So that was a central point. Is people use democracy when they really mean Republican democracy. We emphasize that because it's about the sovereignty coming from below. The power comes from below. That's the key point in all of that. And then my next point about republicanism, and I've only got one of many of those, I think, is to go backwards. We will now return to this one because it's in the wrong order. The second really important point, if it goes, go backwards, please. There we go. You remember that I said that the dynamic, that republicanism had its own dynamic, and the essence of republicanism, starting with this picture at the top here, which is this is a diagram. It's the dominus and the service. It's the idea in social relations that you can have a master and a servant. From the Latin, the Romans use the word dominus and service. And so we have to understand republicanism is not just about democracy, although it is. It's also about the struggle for freedom and for liberty and democracy. So there's a Republican struggle going on wherever oppressed people are fighting back, wherever the services are fighting back against the dominances, then we've got that dynamic. And we could use it in lots of ways. It could be the struggle between men and women for women's liberation. And women's liberation can be seen as part of a Republican struggle, like a particular aspect of it. Or Palestinians against Israelis, a struggle for their freedom and liberty, or the people in the popular idea, the people versus the elites, or black versus white, or Republicans and loyalists. Okay, and of course, this is what the French Revolution talked about. So we get that. What is the French Revolution? Liberty, equality, and well, they had fraternity, but I think it might have meant solidarity, fraternity, the brotherhood of man. It's a kind of an international idea. And those values from the French Revolution remain very relevant to republicanism. And we as socialists have been fighting for equality. That's part of our day-to-day thing that we fight for, but really its root is in the Republican idea of freedom. And it's important because republicanism is not the same as anarchism. It's not anybody can do what they want type of idea of freedom. It's freedom that we gain through the collective, through the democratic. By becoming a democratic organization, we gain our freedom in a collective way. It's not about anarchy and individual freedoms. It's about the collective freedom that's that we gain from organization, from democratic organization. And the one on the bottom corner of these, by the way, is to remind us that if this was the struggle of the parliamentarians against Charles I in the 1640s, that's the dominus service, the tyranny of Charles I and the organization of the parliamentary and popular forces against Charles. You know, again, that's the battle going on there. And the one down the bottom, and this is where Marx comes in, because of course Marx is also talking about dominus servus, but now we're talking about employer-employee. The struggle of employees for liberty, for freedom, is a democratic struggle for democracy in the workplace. And so this is where socialism is now coming back into the story. So it's about oppression and freedom and liberty. And I was thinking about, why did just this last point, why did the Brexiteers do so well and the Remainers did do so badly? Well, if you think about it, the Brexiteers, they used kind of Republican arguments, falsely, by the way, but they said, if we want to be free from this oppressive EU bureaucracy, we must leave the EU. Don't you want freedom? Don't you want to be in control of stuff? And that was the source of the appeal. I mean, as well as making a racist appeal, which they did, but they also made an appeal to people to be free. Let's get liberty from this giant Brussels bureaucracy that's telling us what to do. And that's a powerful argument, and it did gather lots of working class support. For people who feel oppressed, why wouldn't you want to be free? So I think I think the right use that kind of what I'd call that Republican argument. The Remainers, of course, just said, well, you get more jobs if you stay in the EU and things like that, you know. So that didn't appeal to anybody. The economistic argument of the Remainers could not go up against the more libertarian idea of freedom, which the Brexiteers brought into play, you know. And I think that's an important point. Now I'm coming to just to see where we get to. So I'm going to make, I think, just hold on a second. Yeah, there was one other point which I haven't got a PowerPoint on this, but I'll just say this here. The third story, and I'm very quick about this, was I talked about the Republican state. We believe in a state, not ultimately, whereas the anarchists believe you should blow up the state straight away. Republicans, and as Marie and George will show us, Marx was a Republican, but as Republicans, we do believe in a state, even if it's a transitional state. We believe in a different kind of, special kind of state, democratic state, as the way towards socialism. Okay, and the argument I was making in that session was to say that monarchical bureaucratic states, secret state, monarchical states are top-down states with power coming, kingly power coming from the top. And many republics, things called republics, that I call presidential republics, like France or America, republics, they're not the kind of republics that we're really talking about. They are also kind of monarchical states because the president, the executive powers with the president and the armed forces and things of that type. So those presidential states are really not what we're talking about here. We're talking about a democratic republic, not a presidential state, where sovereignty does come genuinely from the people from below. So when people say, don't you want to be like America or France, you Republicans, we say, no, that's not what we're talking about. There's our monarchical features in America, there are monarchical features in France, and we want a genuinely democratic sovereignty from below democracy. And that's quite a radical point to make. Hold on a second, I'm just looking at my notes. Okay, I'm going to my next point. I've got too many points to go. I don't know how the time's going. I've kind of lost track of time. That's the one we already passed over. We did that one. So Republican socialism, I'm going to say this, is a strategy. Call it the Republican Road. I talked about Heaven's Gate. It's a program. It's a plan of action to reform, to make radical reforms, which could be seen as revolutionary if people support that. And it also has to be an organization. It's a strategy program. In other words, you need to have a party, a Republican Socialist Party. And the RSDLP was an example of that, you know, and Republican Labour would be that if there was such a thing as Republican Labour. Now, I've talked about the historical process, so I'm going to pass over this one. and then I'm going to come on to my more or less the last one. I also, towards the end, talked about this idea of social monarchy. So the story that I was telling from the beginning was that we had the English Commonwealth in 1649, that it became the British Empire through this counter-revolution, beginning with Cromwell, the Stuarts, the Glorious, all those other things. We end up with the British Empire, which is an international global phenomenon. And then we've got the decline and fall of the British Empire. So when could we have become a republic? When could the republic have come back again in this process, in this double negative process? When could we have turned from an English republic to the British Empire, then back into an English or even British republic at that point? And I think that you've got to go to the 20th century. I think you've got to go to World War I, 1918. And I think that was a period when we could have turned into a republic. But it didn't happen because the regime at that time won the war and was not, unlike what happened in Germany and Russia, where they were losing the war. Because Britain won the war in 1918, the monarchy was able to hold on, except of course in Ireland, where republicanism did appear from 1916 right up to 1921, the establishment. So there's this element of republicanism at the time of the First World War. And if you read the history story of the First World War, you'll see that the monarchs are very worried. George V was very worried about the danger of republicanism. And you know, he wouldn't let the Tsar come to Britain to see, he wouldn't give the Tsar political asylum. It was an asylum, the Tsar was asylum seeker. George wouldn't let him come here, and it was his cousin, because he was scared that that would tip the country over. And Britain in 1918, 1919 was close to revolution. It was very, you know, the police were on strike in Liverpool and so on and so forth. So there was a kind of Republican moment then. And then I think the next moment would probably be World War II, 1945. And again, of course, Britain didn't lose the Second World War. It was victorious again, only just, because it was just about bankrupt in 1945. And so what you got instead of a republic in 1945, you got the social monarchy. And the social monarchy began earlier. The beginnings of it was in the reign of George V and going on here to George VI. So the social monarchy, the land fit for heroes after what they were told after the First World War, that the soldiers come back, you know, it would be a land fit for heroes. It would be kind of welfare and goodness knows housing and goodness knows what else. People were told that. The social monarchy is consummated, as it were, in 1945 by the Labour government. And it then carried on, of course, after 1945, right the way through Socialism to the mid-1970s, to the crisis of the mid-1970s. And then, of course, we have Thatcher, don't we? We have Thatcher coming along in 1979, beginning to dismantle the social monarchy. And probably the most important event at this time was the 1984-85 miners' strike. It was the defeat of the miners' strike, because it showed that the balance of forces was moving against the welfare state, as it would call, or against the social monarchy. And New Labour was a product of that defeat. And New Labour was, in a sense, a continuation of Thatcherism, as we know. And so the last part of this story, and I heard another little bit of it today, the last part of this story was this period from 2007-8 with the financial crisis that I called the degenerate social monarchy. And the importance of that, okay, is it means that the welfare state is kind of beyond repair. It is so degenerated, it's so broken that it's not going to be possible to. I heard a story today, just on the news at 5 o'clock today, that the court system has collapsed virtually. It just can't do anything at all. It was telling us today, because they've so badly failed to manage it and starved it of funds that it's completely. People having to wait like 3 years or something ridiculous for trials, and the court. It's not the only thing. Everything seems to be completely failed and broken. Is there anywhere you look that it's not broken? The housing market, the finance, just go anywhere, and it's kind of dying. You know, it's in a totally broken state. And the idea of the degenerate social monarchy as a kind of last stage of this process is the idea, really, that we can't go back to 1945 now. We're either going to end up in a transition to an authoritarian state or fascism, or we're back to the English Commonwealth, by the way, which is where I started out. We're going to negate the negation and arrive at the English Commonwealth. And what that means is that the Corbyn programme is not the future for socialism, but it's the past. And in some ways, it's Boris Johnson and the new English nationalist Tories that are carrying out a sort of, let's call it a bastardized one nation social Toryism of levelling up. Okay, they're going to be levelling up. They're not going to level anything up, by the way. Don't worry about that, because they're not going to be capable of doing that. But again, they're making an appeal to the working class on that sort of basis. And what that means, by the way, is that I'll tell you what it means in a minute, the implications of that. And I've got this last couple of points, I think, to make. I've not used Trotsky very much. I don't consider myself to be a Trotskyist. However, Trotsky has some pretty good, useful things to say, and we should use them. He wrote an interesting piece on Britain in the 1920s, which I read with some interest. And so it's interesting to see how he thought about it. Hang on a minute. Yeah, okay. How he thought about it. I'll come back to degeneration in a minute, by the way. How he thought about it. He said, what you need to do is you need to look back into your history, not the Russian, don't concentrate on the Russian Revolution. Think about Oliver Cromwell. Take us back to 1649, he said. Study your own history and how our revolution was defeated. Now, perhaps he should have said the Levellers rather than Cromwell, because Cromwell was a kind of ultimately the Stalin of the English Revolution. So, you know, we're going to be careful of that. He was a revolutionary who turned into a counter-revolutionary. But the point was, he was pointing us back into our history to say that history is relevant today. The English Commonwealth of 1649 is relevant today. And he said another thing as well, which was that the Chartist Party, we should study the Chartist Party. This is very important. And because of all the tactics, all the things you need to know is carried out by the Chartist Party. Now, if you think about the Chartist Party, and I'm going to do a bit more dialectics now, so get ready. Hang on to your hats. Was the first mass working class party in this country, massive mass party. And it was a militant party demanding democratic change. So what the Chartists did was they put democracy as their priority. Now, what they meant by democracy, by the way, is very limited. It wasn't a republic. They just wanted male suffrage. It wasn't even, they didn't even think women should have the vote, you know, so we don't go into all of that. Okay, but the point was at that time in that place, the demand for male suffrage was quite radical, and the ruling class thought it was revolutionary. And the Tories, when the Tories gave the suffrage in 1867, and then they gave more male suffrage in 1884. Okay, when that happened, It was the end of the Chartist movement altogether. And so what you got instead was, you got the Labour Party. The Labour Party replaced the Chartist Party. So that means, in a way, that and what was the thing about the Labour Party? Well, the thing about the Labour Party is that we don't need democracy because we've already got as much democracy as we can possibly stand. So all we need to do is to get into government and carry out social reforms. So it's almost the reverse of the Chartists, who said first democracy, then social change. And the Labour Party said, don't worry about democracy, just get social change. So the Labour Party negates the Chartist Party. So in that sense, what's the double negation then, if I go to the question? If Labour negates the Chartist Party, the double negation is that the Chartist Party comes back again. But it doesn't come back exactly the same, my thesis would be. It doesn't come back planning to give us male suffrage, obviously. So that's not going to be its programme, is it? If it comes back, if the Chartist Party returns, it's going to come back as, and it only can be, a Republican Socialist Party. So I go along with Trotsky on this, that Chartism has a lot to offer. The kind of party which was rooted in the working class, which was a party of militant action, not a purely parliamentary party, has got a lot to offer. And then I think I've got one final point from Trotsky. Okay, so I'm going to finish this. The final point is about the problem that the working class movement faces. Now, Trotsky talked about the gap between objective conditions, which require us to act, and subjective consciousness of knowing or being aware of what we need to do. So, and there's a gap, it's a dangerous gap. So we could say the objective conditions can be expressed that we're living in this epoch of a degenerate social monarchy. That's just a fact. So it means the country is ripe for a democratic republic. But the English left is not conscious of what it needs to do, because the English left at the moment does not think of itself in any kind of Republican sense. So there's a huge gap between what is needed by the situation and what people are ready to do. And that's what we're trying to do here, by the way, is we're hoping to find some way to bridge that gap, to raise the level of Republican socialist consciousness, to bridge the gap between the crisis of democracy and the degeneration of the state. And I wanted to make a couple of points about that, which I didn't make, but I'll make them right now. The degeneration that I've talked about, we can see in three events. One, the Scottish referendum in 2014. Secondly, the election of Jeremy Corbyn in 2015. These are not normal events. They shouldn't normally be happening. They're not the normal politics of this country, neither the Scottish referendum nor Jeremy Corbyn. They're not normal. And then the third not normal thing was the EU referendum of 2016, and the fact that Northern Ireland and Scotland voted to remain, and that the Labour Party was split by that. The Labour Party and the working class movement was split by that, and it ultimately derailed, I think, derailed Corbyn, proved fatal for Corbyn in 2019. So those are the problems that we have got to go. And I think I've got my last one. I hope it's not gone too long. I probably have. Anyway, what do we need to take on? These are just some of the things that we need to, I try to take on in our arguments, just trying to summarize them. We need to take on the argument about the distinction between the Queen and the Crown. That's really important. We need to take on the idea that republicanism is different from anti-monarchism. We need to explain the nature of the Crown as a corporate body, as a power with the treasury at its heart, as an employer of millions of people, as the concentration of the political power of capital. It's nothing feudal about it. It's the power of the state power is the power of capital. That sovereignty needs to be with the people and not the crown in what they say, sovereignty of parliament, sovereignty of the crown in parliament. That the union between England, Scotland, Northern Ireland, Wales is not some kind of proletarian internationalism that we must defend. Okay, it isn't. And that there is a massive democratic deficit and a dangerous democratic deficit in England, which threatens the breakup of England. I mean, in all sorts of ways, into divide and makes England, keeps the Tories in power, by the way, over the whole union. So we have to address the crisis of democracy in England. And that brings me back to the question then of the issues of the English Commonwealth, the English democratic and social republic as the answer. We've arrived in that arc from 1649 via the British Empire, via the breakup of the British Empire, and how we've arrived in the 21st century. So all the roads, all my roads point in one direction. I think that's the conclusion I want to end up with. And I will finish there. Oh yeah, go. Oh, hang on a minute. Hang on. Oh, that's on a second. Yeah, no, I did add one more. Sorry, I forgot. Here we go. England. So I will end at this point. England's Commonwealth as a democratic and social republic with an English Parliament. Ben was in favour of an English Parliament, but he also was in favour of a Scottish and Welsh one. We should repeal or end the Union. Ben only wanted to end Northern Ireland. A federal republic is we should make the point that federalism, by the way, is going to appear from the right. Gordon Brown is going to defend the Union by calling for federalism. He's actually talking about a federal monarchy, not a federal republic. So we're going to have to deal with the question of federalism, because a lot of the Labour centrists will use federalism to defend the Union. We're in favour of only of a voluntary federation, where there's a right to referendum, right to self-determination. If we want to see a union of free peoples, perhaps Ireland, Scotland, England, in a voluntary federation, not in one that's imposed by the domination of England. And federal republicanism can also be a perspective towards Europe. So our federal republic, there are federal republican arguments which are internationalist. We're not narrow English nationalists or anything like that. We want to look outward, but we're not imposing anything on Ireland, Scotland, or Wales. And that's back finally to Marx's view about Ireland. So rather than Ben's view, I've got Marx's view at this point. What Marx said was Ireland should be separate from England, but after it's separate, then they can become we could become a federal republic. And the English working class is not going to leave it up to the Irish. The English working class must call for the repeal of the Act of Union. It should be, what should we say, an article of faith for the English working class. So for me, this is where we'll also be controversial when we start talking to other people. Ending the Union, I think it's quite a radical idea on the English left. And it's one we're going to have to be able to deal with. And I will end, I think, I will end this time. I'm sorry about that. I'll try again. I'm going to try to end again. Here we go. Bang. You know it's ended when Her Majesty comes up. Yeah, but not quite goodbye. So there we go. That's really the end this time. Well, I better stop sharing.
Well, that was absolutely brilliant, Steve. Wow. I mean, you've traced it all the way, from the Commonwealth right the way through to the conference today. And I had no idea how that all fitted together until you've done that tonight. Absolutely fantastic. I really, really enjoyed that. So we now need to throw it open to questions. And I think everyone's stunned. Oh no, George is, everyone's so stunned by your brilliance. I haven't got a question. No, George, actually I saw George's hand up. Yeah, George and Mari. Okay,
Yeah.
George.
Thank you
Thank
for
you.
your brilliant expose and applying the dialectic method all the way through the lecture, because that is quite important. I think we've got to work dialectically outside when we approach our comrades in the Labour Party. Looking at the Chartist, Helen Macfarlane translated the Communist Manifesto, and she published it in the Red Republican, which was a organ of the Chartists. That I considered to be very significant because, as Marx actually has tried to stress all the way through, that ultimately he wanted not just socialism, but communism in the end. And regarding the double negation, I was a bit confused at the beginning because you said the double negation, and I felt in my mind, surely you mean the negation of the negation. The negation of the negation is a constant process where contradictions reoccur in a span of time, and you negate that contradiction and come up with the solution, and then it recurs again. Talking about power, power is pyramid shape. The objective is to turn the pyramid completely upside down. And I think you've actually stressed that on a number of occasions through your address. And also, I'm glad that you have brought up the matter of internationalism, because that's important when we project our argument, because we're looking towards an internationalist solution, not just simply in England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, or United Ireland, because ultimately it won't happen in my generation, but there will be a United Ireland, I think, in the future. And also, the first job is the democratic deficit. And the only way you can deal with that is from the bottom. And that means whatever you're doing, whether you're inside the Labour Party or outside the Labour Party, you try to set up informal groups and discuss it with people and bring the narrative into the public realm. Thank you. I will stop there. I've had my...
Oh, thank you, George. I hope to pick up on some of those points. That's excellent.
Mari, have your hand up. Mari, over to you.
Hello. Yes, I agree. This was quite a difficult thing to summarize for Steve in such a short time, and it was quite well done. So it's very moving. I want to make a few points. Is that he has introduced more clearly the principle of the dialectic, which is happening all the time. Everything is contradictions, and every time you have a contradiction, you have the negation of what happened before, and yet it goes back to what it was in a different form. So it's important because in the Labour Party, they have no such concepts. They see things in a linear, gradual, progressive, and in fact, it's some sort of negation of evolution. It's as if somehow things had always been as they are now, and they will always be. It's almost religious. There's something religious in the backwardness of the way of thinking in the Labour Party. I think it was so important, this mention that there's a need of a party. There's something that was worrying me is that, yeah, well, we are all Republicans and then we launch in. No, we need to think. I was thinking of Larry's example recently. He said in a demonstration, some comrades were kettled, communist comrades were kettled, and the rest of the demonstration did not think of demanding their freedom from the kettle. I think that was a very good observation, but at the same time, then we wanted the democratic right of the comrades not to be kettled. And then from that demand to more demands, you arrive in front of a confrontation. It's no longer just democracy and more democracy. It is democracy changes and becomes qualitatively an action of militancy. Then at that point, he needs a party which says, well, is it relevant? Is it appropriate to do it now? Are there the forces to do it? Are we going to get hit over the head if we start something which is not well considered? This is where the party comes in. And then I think about democracy in the end, it exists only because it is missing. The day when the relations between people are free, like a federation where people can belong or not belong, where they are free to join the federation because it's more convenient and it's more productive, but they can also leave. When you have that, then democracy starts not being needed anymore. So there will be a point in the future when democracy will disappear because there will no longer be any antagonisms. But that, of course, is a long way away, but it's interesting to think about it because it's not an eternal value. It is, and it's also only a means, because it's only one means, because the actual means for change is the confrontation and the militancy and the audacity, which is another level of democracy. And then finally, I think about a lot was said about England, and I want to go back to this. I can see the need. I would like Steve, please, to explain if these MPs who are English MPs, when he was counting that the English MPs are not, are becoming more and more, some of them are becoming more and more to the right, they are going to the right. When this happens, does it not mean that we us as Republican, then we must look for allies in Scotland, Wales, and everywhere, Ireland, looking for allies there, because nobody in the British Isles is going to free themselves unless we all club together. That sort of thing. And so I think that needs also, with the repeal of the Act of Union, that needs to be considered. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mari. Excellent points as well. Steve, do you want to come back on those points?
Yeah, okay. Well, the last one, first of all, I'll start with that. I mean, I think it links to what George said. I think I've tried to say that republicanism is a universal thing. It's not an English thing or British thing or French thing or anything like that. It's a universal idea ultimately for the world and for humanity and for liberation of the world, you know, and that's what we often say about socialism as well. So I don't think it contradicts that. And if it's not the same, so I think the English republicanism, if it's not narrow little Englander stuff, it's not English nationalism, let's say. English republicanism is internationalism. And so what we're saying, I think what we should be saying is that we in England, the people of England, which by the way, are all the people settled here. It's not people who've got Anglo-Saxon, white Anglo-Saxons and all that sort of nonsense. The people who went back to Alfred the Great or something like that. So anybody, all the citizens of this country, so variable, coming from different, all those things, the multi-ethnic, multiracial England. All right, we don't want to keep control of Scotland or Wales. All right, we want them to be completely free. The only people who are trying to keep control of them is the British ruling class. We don't want to do that. And by the way, the people in Scotland, Wales, Ireland will think, therefore, that we are their allies, by the way, in this. So this will be a kind of genuine internationalism once they see, and this was Marx's argument about Ireland. If the English working class would really support Ireland, then the English working class would not be tied up with their own ruling class at that point. And then the Irish working class think, you know what, the English working class are on our side and we're on their side. And the working class is all united.
Yeah.
So saying that we don't want the union, get rid of the union, is about getting ourselves closer to Ireland, Scotland and Wales by getting rid of this stupid union by which England, the Anglo-British, dominate the whole island. So in a way, that I still see that as more Marx than Ben. It's a bit, so Ben was going down that direction because he was recognizing the need for parliaments for Wales and Scotland and Ireland, and that's in his bill. But we never got one for England. That's the other point. So I think, so we are speaking English. So I think English Republicans, I believe, are Europeans, actually. I think we're the Anglo-Europeans taking on the Anglo-British. That's the way to think of it. The Anglo-British, as I try to say, the British are a dying breed for all sorts of reasons. The Empire's gone, the Union's gone. There'll be no more British soon. And we're not the rear guard trying to cling on to the British. We're the vanguards. They get rid of it quick, faster, even faster than ever. Let's be the English, let's be the Anglo-Europeans. After all, England's a great European place. So I think that's it. Whether we're in the European Union or not in the European, we are part of the European working class. We are part of the European Republican tradition. We can, all those sorts of things. So English Republicanism is not English nationalism, not petty Little Englander stuff. It's actually the alternative. That's what I'm saying. That's the point I was saying last week, was to get over the idea that English Republicanism is the alternative to English nationalism. Tony Benn is the alternative to Enoch Powell. That's how I was trying to get that argument over last time. So I hope that answers both George's point as well about republicanism being international. And therefore it's quite consistent with socialism as an international idea, as well. I like Marie's religion of backwardness in the Labour Party, but people who are clinging on to the union are in the religion of backwardness. That's what the people who are clinging on to the monarchy are in the religion of backwardness.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes, and absolutely true. We need a party. We need to get a program for the program actually builds the party, not the other way around. So the more programmatic clarity we can get in our ideas, plans, and strategies, the more the party takes shape around that. So I agree with that, and I also agree. Republican socialism is not the same as communism, but communism, I would argue, is a strand of Republican socialism. And Marie's absolutely right that one day, and that was Marx's idea, that you'd need a Republican state, but that Republican state would disappear, it would wither away. You wouldn't need it, like the way that Marie said, you won't need democracy one day, it would just become not necessary. But at the moment it is. Because that's the only way the working class can organize itself collectively and gain political power in that way, by democracy, which is, the Republican road to socialism, as I said. I'm trying to look back. I agreed, just going back to, I'm trying to pick up, George said lots of things and I agree with them. Helen McFarlane was very important. I'm glad you reminded me, because I knew a guy called Dave Black who wrote a book about Helen McFarlane. And of course, George Julian Harney did, the Chartists weren't Republicans, but the left wing were, and George Julian Harney was a Republican. He did the Red Republican, so that's where there's a Republican socialist element on the left of Chartism. And the two things that were missing from Chartism that weren't missing from France in 1848, the French wanted a republic, and they wanted, I think, votes for women. I'm pretty sure they had in 1848 votes for women. So whereas the Chartists didn't have that, and it required the suffragettes as I see the suffragettes as a kind of Chartism for women almost, you know, in a certain sense, a militant direct action movement for votes for women, just as the Chartist movement was. So yeah. Negation of the negation, I just call it a double negation. I think we're talking the same thing there, George. I've seen the double negation term, and that's what I think. Oh, there was one point I didn't say, but I want to get this one out, that republicanism should be seen as always coming from below. And therefore, we're not waiting, we're not queuing up outside Buckingham Palace with placards. Our idea is of civic republicanism. Civic republicanism is that you can be active in your local communities, in your local trade unions. You can be an active Republican by being an organizer, by being a shop steward, by engaging in political action, because republicanism values citizens getting active. So what that means is that although we think it's been trade union activism, you could say that's just a manifestation of a kind of Republican culture. We should be. We should be responsible. You know, responsible citizens are going to do things and not just sit on their asses watching telly all the time, type of approach, like I want to do. But anyway, so yeah, I missed that point out. That was one of the many points that I'd missed out. But anyway, got quite a few more than that.
Celia. Celia's got her hands up. Over to you, Celia.
Yeah, sorry, I've got a slight cold. Just wanted to talk some experience I had with a taxi driver, and made me realize how easy it is, really easy it is to convert people to republicanism, because, you know, he was pro Scottish independence, complaining about the English, and by the end of the trip, well, was a bit more than that because he wouldn't let me go, but I'd completely converted him. And he said to me, oh, so if Scotland gets its independence now, it will just be a fake independence. And I said, my work here is done. You know, that's it. But, you know, and the thing about the, the establishments managed to persuade us that it's between, you know, the Scots and the English and so on. And I said, it's not, it's between the ordinary people and the elite of both countries, and that we should unite as the ordinary people against the, so on, you know, that was the argument I was using. And there was and he said, yeah, we've got to get rid of the Queen, you know, that. And I said, no, it's not enough. You know, he said about getting an elected representative. I said, no, it's not enough, because all you'll do is have the same institutions, the same things ruling us. It has to, you have to completely reform, democratize the crown and change it. And he completely got it. And I don't see what the difficulty is after that of persuading people.
Wow, that's amazing, Celia. Maybe you should write a script, you know? Whenever we meet people, we can say what you said.
What I thought was so funny was he, you know, got to my destination and got out the cab, and he got out the cab, and there was all my neighbors listening to this huge conversation we were having for about an hour.
About an hour, wow.
Yeah, I feel so kind of empowered by that. Yeah.
Can I just comment on what Celia said, because I think it's important. It just allows me to stress something else. I was trying to say that there are many little sects, small groupings with particular versions of this, that, and the next thing, and we've all been in some of them probably. We've been in all of them, who knows? But anyway, but Republican socialism is not a sect politics. There may be only 10 of us here or whatever number, like, so we're like a small sect of 10 people, you know what I mean, in a room somewhere. But my argument is that Republican socialism, and certainly the arguments for republicanism, are mass politics. They're capable because they are an argument for reforming the system in a democratic way. And because of that, they can win thousands, hundreds or millions of people. You know, if it's a sect of true believers in the Communist Manifesto or something like that, so a lot of people will do that, but there will be a fringe. There will be a marginal fringe until conditions change. But I think republicanism is part of our history, our culture, and it's possible to mobilize that as mass politics. So I'm not trying to get the, you know, we're not trying to invent the, I don't know, the Judean Front for the Liberation of Judea or whatever it was in the Monty Pythons or whatever. It's not one of those. It's to try to think of a party which is like the Chartist Party, which was a mass party of working class democracy. And Republican socialism has the potential, despite the fact that there's only so many of us here talking about this, it has potentially. And what Celia's just said, I think makes that point, that you can engage with ordinary people in the way that she's just done. And that tells me that we're not sort of going, she's not going to, have you read chapter 3 of Das Kapital on the, you know, it's not, that's not the argument we're having. It's an argument about life and about democracy and how, you know, what we need to do. So I think, you know, that's what we have to think. We've got mass politics here, even though there's only 10 of us, potentially anyway.
Thanks very much, Steve. If I may be allowed to ask a question. The politics is becoming clearer and clearer to me with every session that we have. But how are the economics going to work? If we can have a federation of England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland, which sounds absolutely spot on, how will the money work? Will each Parliament draw taxes from people living in their particular area, Wales, Scotland, where we're talking about? So will the taxes be extracted from the people in your area, and then that Parliament will then decide how those taxes are spent? Or will there be a pooling of money in the federation? I'm just interested in how the economics are going to work.
Well, okay, that's in itself a big question. What I would say is I don't want to get locked into saying that we will have a federal republic. What I was trying to say was that what we should be aiming at immediately is the Commonwealth of England, which is a republic, a democratic and social republic in England. And that if we conduct ourselves in an internationalist way by getting rid of the Union, a possible federal relationship with Scotland, Wales, and Ireland would be possible. Because if we end up fighting, you know, if we end up in a sort of breakup scenario like Yugoslavia, then we'll all hate each other, the Scots, Welsh, and English forevermore. But we're not going to allow that as a working class movement. So that's why we want a peaceful end to the Union, a peaceful and rapid end to the Union. Therefore, that we could get together. But I wouldn't want to say that we just think we should just get together with Wales, Scotland, and Ireland. We could just as well get together with France, or we'd as well get together with the other parts of the European Union. If they had a perspective of a federal republic, that would be democratic and internationalist. It's not the European Union with its giant or not that very big bureaucracy anyway. But really, the European Commission is like the Crown. It's a body which the European Parliament doesn't control. The European Union is not a democratic organization. It's actually a kind of gathering of this. So there is a problem. There is a genuinely democratic deficit in the European Union that we should be addressing. That, you know, we're Eurosceptics, not in the sense of meaning we should leave the European Union necessarily, but we should be Eurosceptics, meaning skeptical of the model of Euro bureaucracy. Yeah. But to me, the coming together of the European nations in the European Union points to the day when we could have a genuine federal united Europe, a United States of Europe, and on a really radical democratic basis. So I don't think we can say we will first have a federal relationship with Scotland, but not with France. I mean, what will happen, we don't know, but these are possibilities, you know. But what we should be saying is we want, what we should be arguing is that we want to end the democratic deficit in England. We don't want to keep control of these other nations. There
Mm.
should be a parliament. It should be elected by proportional representation. Everybody should be elected, accountable, and subject to recall. We should have regional democracy. We should have local democracy, assemblies in our local areas, so that we have a fully democratic system. And that's a system that will allow the working class to really decide for itself how to expand the public sector, how to do that. We'd need a completely different taxation. So going back to your question, Carol, maybe because they've kept right away from economics at the moment. But I think the Republic would have a different way of taxing. I think that the HMRC is a kind of taxation system invented for the rich to make sure they don't pay any taxes.
Yeah, that's true.
So there's a huge amount of taxes that could and should be paid by any democratic state.
Yeah.
You know, so I think taxation would be quite different, because a lot of money is leaking out the system we don't even know about. You know, so I think that doesn't really answer your question, but yes, I think a completely different progressive taxation system would be what a republic would have.
Mm.
You know, and the republic would want a welfare state. It would have a welfare state. It would want social care to be a part of the public sector. It would want what Ben called for, which is a national legal service, to ensure that every citizen had an access to a lawyer when they needed it, in the same way as we need access to doctors. So I think there's lots of reforms that a democratic republic would make possible for us. And because it's a mass thing, we can't really say what the masses of people would do, but the more open, the more information we've got, the more truth we've got, and all those other things, I think would make for a much better society than the one we're living in at the present moment in time, which is going down the tubes, down the pan, down the toilet, or whatever it is, rapidly. Exactly.
Yeah, thank you very much, Steve. That sounds really good. Jenny was the next one. Jenny?
I wasn't intending to talk about economics, but since it's been raised, I will. I mean, I think it's a question of where there's a will, there's a way. If people have the right foundations, if they have come together and decided they have a shared vision, then they will find some way through the problems. But I think on the economic side, it's not so much a question of money, it's more about resources. And that's where we always fall down. How are the resources to be allocated? You know, who's got more of what and who's got less of it? And those problems become complicated when you work in a federal system. So I'm not saying it would be easy. I think it would be very complicated, and it would. But in the working out of it, you would hope that instead of falling apart, people would actually come together to find those solutions in an ideal world. I don't know whether that would happen. My question was going to be about where Steve sees the trade unions positioning themselves on this. They seem to encompass such a wide range of left and right wing views that I find it difficult to see how they might fit into this. Do you think, Steve, this is something that would appeal to unions, given their desperate desire at the moment to retain jobs at all costs, that's what drives them really?
That's an excellent question. Jennifer. Paul, your hand was up next.
With regard to Europe, I think like a kind of a federal Europe without being a federal Europe under the current understanding of more of an international approach is along the lines of what socialist appeal, and I believe the Communist Party also want. They basically want a federation of Europe, but obviously it should be run by the working class. That's basically their position. So they don't mean a federal Europe in the sense that the EU means it. It's a totally different thing. On the question of taxes and money, I would like to think that when we become a republic and we start rejigging the tax system, that we gradually move to a system where the vast bulk of taxes come from land value rather than personal income and employment. I find it astonishing, especially when you consider how land differs compared to products that we make. Of course, the whole thing about land is that you can't produce more of it. You can only decide its usage and who can access it, etc., etc. So I do hope that we talk about land value tax or land reform in general, but a land tax in itself would go a long way because it's all about encouraging optimum use of land. Yeah, I'll stop there.
All right, that's some more excellent points. Yeah, land, definitely. Base it on land. Good idea. Diana has her hand up. Diana?
Yeah. I'll take that down. Oh, I'm gonna get it wrong. Paul, I agree. Paul has made a very important point about land reform. That we really need that. The point about unions and people, the almost a fetishization of jobs. I haven't had a job for 20 years, and quite frankly, I'm delighted. I don't want a job. I'm so glad I don't have to work anymore. But that's not to say that there's never been occasions when I haven't got satisfaction out of work. But a lot of the work I did, the stuff I got paid for, was useless. David Graeber has written an excellent book on that, Bullshit Jobs.
Bullshit jobs.
But I'm also rather inclined to agree with Guy's standing that we should look into basic income. But what the point I sort of originally wanted to make was sort of, what do we do with the tyranny of the transnational corporations? Because they are what are really ruling us and really controlling us. And it's dangerous. I mean, it's they who are just destroying the environment. With that, I mean, they're sort of neoliberal capitalists destroying the environment, driving species to extinction, and possibly not too long in the future us as well. So that seems to me a sort of fairly urgent thing to deal with.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah. What are we going to do about them? Yeah, really good point, Diana.
And that goes to negation of things. Boris Johnson's levelling up is actually bulldozing down. Bulldozing down ancient forests, or bulldozing down the environment generally, and driving everybody down to the same level of poverty.
Yeah, thanks very much, Diana. Steve, do you want to come back on those, because you've had quite a few questions now.
I agree with.
Would you like to come back?
Sorry, I'm not on mute. Yes. Just to start with last point. Yeah, Boris Johnson's driving down, but he's made progress because he's taken the rhetoric of poverty. He knows what Jeremy Corbyn convinced the ruling class was there's a real problem, And only a politician that could take on Jeremy Corbyn and promise more and promise like more control, take back control, Brexit, could also then level up and invest and all. It's a lot of the rhetoric of, it's a lot of Corbyn's rhetoric carried out by Boris Johnson, but obviously not the same. You know, it's like empty rhetoric, you know, and which will be seen to be that it'll be leveling down or driving down or however Diana described it rarely. But people, I guess, have to see that somehow before they come, because not everybody follows politics like we do. So people will be taken in by rhetoric for a while, and then eventually come to say, well, that's not really working. You know, so I think people learn from experience. They don't learn like we do as this relatively small politicized grouping of activists and socialists and so on. They just learn through, you know, watching and observing and all those other things. So, but in other words, it's another attempt to revive the social monarchy, which will prove to be unrevivable, because you can't do the leveling up with. My argument would always be, without democracy, with democracy, the people can level themselves up, because they've got the power to do that, the power to direct those resources, and so that's why it's that's why democracy is so important, because it's about self-empowerment of people to be deciding these things. Which is why we can't totally say what economic policy people will have. But I like the way that Jennifer described it, that people would, the more openness, the more facts, that most of the stuff we don't know about because it's kept secret and hidden from us. So a democracy that's open with its information, where the books are open, we could make a hell of a lot of better decisions straight away by finding out where the money went and who was doing what with it, which is all being kept secret by the Crown state that we. And of course, Diana's right that transnational corporations are very, very powerful and they really control things, but they control it because they can control a territory, and they control Britain, not just direct themselves, but they control the crown, the power of the state. They need the state. So you can't deal with multinational corporations in a crown state, which is geared up for protecting them. If people get power, people get democracy, they can challenge it. But again, there's an international dimension you don't have. So really, you've got to spread democracy internationally. You know, the fact is that your republic's got to spread. Otherwise, you will be isolated by the transnational corporations. You can't defeat the transnational corporations in one country. If you don't get political power in one country, you can't even begin. You know, that's how it's a politics and economics is tied up together. So we need the French working class. We need a People's Republic in France, in Italy, in Germany, and all that. When we've got all those things together, when we start to build all that, in Scotland, Wales, then the transnationals, you know, really, they're on the run, not they are at the moment. What else? I'm just trying to look back. I'm trying to remember everything I've said. I don't think we can know how, as I say, I think that the problem of allocating resources, that people will work out what the priorities are by having a democracy, by bringing information, by everybody knowing how things work, because the working class knows how everything works. The working people do everything in bits. People don't know what anybody else, but we don't know what teachers do, but teachers certainly do, and they're part of the working class. We don't know what, I don't know, train drivers do, but train drivers know all about that, and they're part of the working class too. So in a way, we know, collectively, we know everything about what's going on. And if we all blew the whistle, we could find out all the secrets. All the secretaries that have got, or whoever they may be, have just got to open all the files up and show where all the secret files. So really, with the information, and that's what a democratic republic, what a democrat is about, opening, getting to truth, getting closer to knowing what's really happening, and being able to mobilize the knowledge of people to do that. That's bound to be an much better economic policy. I don't know, was somebody, I don't know, it might have been Jennifer, said about trade unions. I think republicanism, and that was my point, is very appealing if it's properly understood to trade union rank and file members. All it really says is the rank and file of the trade union is sovereign. Everything should be democratically, everything they do is elected, accountable, and subject to recall. So it's about the empowerment of the rank and file of the trade unions. Why wouldn't they like that? Why wouldn't they think that was important? And it's the same in the Labour Party. Republican democracy in the Labour Party means everybody's got to be elected accountable, subject to recall. You couldn't have the parliamentary party and these MPs reselecting themselves if the Labour Party was actually republicanly democratic, you know, and it accepted that power was not in the hands of the central bureaucracy, but was in the hands of the members. Just looking around, I've got little notes here. I'm just trying to see if there's anything else I've missed. The economics of the Republic. Well, you've got the Treasury, you've got HMRC, then you've got the question of land. I think land and finance would be very, very important for any policy. The Republic would need to control the land. So I think land would be publicly owned, and we would need to control some or all of the banks. You know, I think controlling the banks would be absolutely crucial. That's two policies I think that a republic would have to have if it was to be stable at all. How much more nationalization would be done, I think would be people decide that. So I think that we should talk more. We did say this, and in the next education series, we are going to talk about land, because I think land and republicanism go together. And Jennifer is going to do something with me, without me, whatever. We're going to do something on land because it's really important. And just finish on this point, the last sort of project was called the Land and Labour League in the 1870s that Karl Marx was involved in, and it produced a magazine called The Republic. So for Marx, the question of the Republic was tied up with the question of land and the question of labour. So I think that's a good point to end. Land and labour and the Republic kind of all go together. Or land and freedom in the Spanish was the title. Land and freedom, wasn't that? Whose film was that? I'm just trying to remember now. Ken Loach's Land and Freedom, about the Spanish Revolution. Land and Freedom. I think hopefully, if anything I haven't asked, I've now lost track of. I'm just looking at my notes. I think hopefully I've answered your questions. If not, we can carry on some other time discussing it. I'll look at the chat a second. Yeah, 9 new messages before we end. Okay. I think we're more or less ending there, Carol, because look, we've come to 9.
Yes, well, it is exactly 9 o'clock, so that's a good place to end it on the land issue. Very, very, very important. How can you have equality in a land where how the land is in the hands? Well, the Crown owns all the land, actually, in the country, doesn't it? Even if you've got freehold, you're only holding it on behalf of the Crown. Yeah. So the land issue is so important, so important. Mari has a hand up. Mari?
Yeah, just briefly. I think we should. Are we finishing? Is this the beginning of the end of the session?
Yeah,
yes, it's the beginning of the end. Yes, the end of, or is it the end of the? It's either that or it's the end of the beginning. I don't know which.
Okay. So in that case,
if we go negation of the negation, is it the beginning of the end or the end of the beginning?
I'm going to negate and negate to make it better.